Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you very much again to Deborah and Unchantra. So I think now the scene has been set. We've heard about the provisions under about our rules of origin from Deborah, and Unchantra has spoken about the proactive approach of MOC to prepare for RCEP, and including giving some examples. So in one sense, this is like the supply side. Now we really want to look at the demand side and see how businesses can make use of the provisions and navigate the regulatory system to their benefit. So for this, I am joined by two experts. Let me introduce them. The first is Mr. Clint O'Connell. He is partner and head of tax and customs at DFDL. Clint may be a familiar face as he's been in Cambodia for over a decade. Clint is a tax man, not one taking your money, rather acting as a tax advisor both to multinational and regional businesses looking to invest in Cambodia, as well as providing tax assistance to many local businesses. He also contributes to, amongst others, the International Tax Review and Bloomberg BNA's Tax Planning International Asia Pacific Focus Journal. So thank you for joining us, Clint. Our second panelist will be Robin Flint. Since December, Robin has been First Secretary at the Australian Embassy in Cambodia. However, prior to this posting, Robin helped negotiate several Australian free trade agreements where he focused on issues including rules of origin, product-specific rules, customs procedures, and agricultural goods market access. So, thank you, Robin, for joining us as well. Now, we really want to make this session as interactive as possible, giving you an opportunity to ask questions and think aloud with the support of our two experts. So please, if you have any questions, type them into the Q&A box and I will pose the questions to the experts. But to get started, I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator to get the conversation going by asking our experts some questions each. So if I start with you, Clint. So we've now been hearing from Deborah and Unchantra about the provisions of the agreement and the government response. But coming from the private sector and dealing with businesses, both in Cambodia and outside, do you think investors are aware of and interested in the rules of origin?
Thank you, Jeremy. And before I get started, good morning to Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. So with respect to the interest, firms like ours, DFDL, and Dr. Sapana, we tend to act a little bit like a canary in the well when it comes to dealing with FDI into Cambodia. Typically, whether they like it or not, investors need to come and see legal advisors and tax advisors. So we tend to be at the front line when it comes to looking or dealing with foreign investors. So what we've seen in recent times is a great deal of interest in RCEP. That is combined with other developments in Cambodia, such as the new law on investment and the free trade agreements that Cambodia has signed with China and Korea. So typically when firms like ours and Dr. Sapana's firm, when we advise new client or new investors into Cambodia, We talk about the legal issues, the tax issues, and also the customs issues. So one of the key things that we look at, as was touched on earlier by Deborah and His Excellency, was the benefit of treaties such as RCEP, and of course the key to unlocking the benefits of those treaties is the rules of origin and the ability to obtain certificates of origin. So it is indeed one of the key features that we have been dealing with and advising new advisors to the market in Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint, for that. So are Cambodian, in your perspective, are Cambodian exporters taking advantage of the FTA provisions? And what more could be done to ensure that Cambodian businesses do not lose out?
I think, as the representative from the Ministry of Commerce quite rightly pointed out, there are some industries in Cambodia that are very well aware of the benefits of the Certificate of Origin and free trade agreements, in particular GMAC. Obviously, that's one of the foremost industries in Cambodia with respect to the export of garments. There are some industries where I think we need to improve with respect to teaching or spreading the word, if you like, on the benefits of free trade agreements such as RCEP. I have to give a lot of kudos to His Excellency Soksapana, who's been doing an amazing job with spreading the word with articles in local newspapers. I think I've seen him on a number of webinars, even with my home country, New Zealand, as far as that. So he's doing a fantastic job in spreading the word. But we do need to have, I think, more dialogue. Happy to hear, I think, as you were with the Ministry of Commerce, with their ambition to spread the word as well. But yeah, I think generally there is a good level of understanding, given that since Cambodia's accession to the WTO in the early 2000s, which essentially brought in the rules of origin to Cambodia, it has been around for some time. But I think particularly for SMEs in Cambodia and industries which perhaps were not previously encouraged to export, like in particular agriculture, which I think is going to be a key industry going forward, perhaps we need to spread the word a bit more.
Thank you. And that all sounds very positive, and it's good to know. We've heard your positive feedback about the efforts of Soksapana, but we've heard from Ministry of Commerce that they're being proactive, and this is something that Deborah also recognized about the proactive approach in Cambodia. So I think that bodes very well for the future. Robin, perhaps if I can come on to you, and before asking you about Australian businesses and rules of origin, as a negotiator, can I ask you for your perspective about the rationale for the RCEP ROO during the RCEP negotiations and the resulting benefits the agreed outcomes provide for business?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And good morning, everyone on the line as well. So, I mean, that's a very good question. It's obviously with an agreement like RCEP, which has 15 members, and during the negotiations, there were 16 members with India part of the negotiations as well. You can imagine that it's a very complex negotiation for all parties to be able to get what they want, particularly for rules of origin, while also protecting, their own sensitivities and protecting their own domestic policies as well. So it was definitely a very, I think, difficult and challenging negotiation over the almost decade that RCEP was being negotiated. But I think there were some certain core principles that negotiators and parties were very conscious of. And first and foremost, I think it was the idea that ASEAN is at the center of RCEP was quite critical, and being able to build upon the ASEAN Plus FTAs was really an important core principle for negotiators. Secondly, I think there was a real attempt to really comply with WTO rules as much as we can, and try to embed those rules within the FTA themselves, particularly in relation to the revised Kyoto Convention Annex K, which is the WTO guidance on rules of origin, and also the WTO's trade facilitation agreement, which sort of crosses into the rules of origin space as well. I think thirdly, there was a real attempt to establish very trade facilitative rules, which are easy for business to understand, while also protecting the RCEP regional supply chain. And I think lastly, there was a real attempt to provide certainty to traders, and to develop the regional supply chain. Can I ask everyone to go on mute? Sorry, there was some feedback coming through. Jeremy, in terms of the benefits, I think, you know, there was a question on the chat previously about, you know, who's going to see the most benefit, you know, the biggest jump in through the rules of origin and through the trade in RCEP. And I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because I think every party, every member will gradually, as they get used to RCEP, understand its benefits and tap into its preferences over time. I think there will be some parties that will benefit more quickly, such as the North Asian members, China, Japan, Korea, as it's quite a new agreement for them. But we have to remember that RCEP operates in parallel to all other FTAs that are in existence in the region. So RCEP doesn't supersede or take over from, you know, the CPTPP, which some members are a part of, or other bilateral agreements that members might have with each other. So RCEP really provides an option for traders and business people to tap into if they feel that there is a benefit that benefits them. I think, just to close off on this question, the biggest benefit for me is really the regional integration component of the RCEP, you know, supply and production chain that it produces. So I think through the accumulation model that RCEP has, there's a real benefit for countries like Cambodia to really analyze how they fit into an RCEP regional production and supply chain. Where do they sit within that downstream production system? And can they set themselves up as a production base for input materials into the auto industry? Or can they set themselves up as a distribution hub for electronic goods for the RCEP region? So these are really questions that over time, I think, will be answered by a lot of businesses, and particularly in Cambodia. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how you know, businesses in Cambodia can really take advantage of the RCEP benefits.
Thank you, Robin. I think it is good to remember that RCEP is operating in a very dynamic environment, and RCEP is one way forward, one option for companies. I do have another question for you, but just to remind those watching, please don't be shy, write your questions in the chat box. This should really be a dialogue between you and the experts rather than me and the experts. So please feel free to add your comments or questions for the experts. Let's look a little bit about the Australia and what happens there. And can you give me a sense of how Australian businesses use the ROO in ASEAN RCEP?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question as well. I think, Jeremy, it's Certainly for RCEP, because it's such a new agreement, it's hard to sort of analyze the uptake of Australian businesses for RCEP in particular. But I can talk more generally about, you know, FTAs in the region and how Australian businesses do use rules of origin. The expectation for Australian businesses is that over time, we will start to see more and more Australian traders tap into RCEP. We have to remember that for Australian exporters, a lot of our export is done under our bilateral FTAs with our regional partners, as well as under our ASEAN +2 FTA, the ANZUTA agreement with Australia and New Zealand. So we do have a huge volume of trade that already goes under those agreements, and we expect that RCEP will, you know, over time, businesses will start to tap into RCEP where there's a benefit that ANZUTA and our bilateral FTAs don't necessarily provide, and that's talking specifically about goods trade, not about investment or services or the digital space, for example. But Australian businesses tend to be quite savvy around FTA rules of origin use. We find that because of the way that Australia produces its goods, we typically find that most businesses who utilize tariff preference under FTAs will export under wholly obtained or produced entirely origin criteria in FTAs. And this is because most of Australia's exported product is either agricultural goods, wine, or mineral products, which are more easily sort of grown and harvested in Australia, or produced entirely from Australian originating materials. And that's quite in contrast, I think, to the situation in Cambodia, where we would likely see more exports from Cambodia to the region really be more around manufactured goods, electronic components, textiles, bicycles, footwear, things like that, which are more manufactured goods, which require imported material to produce. And we'll see from, I think from Cambodia, a more of a requirement to comply with product-specific rules, change in tariff classification, or regional value content rules when they trade under RCEP. I think Australian businesses tend to rely a lot on brokers, as well as freight forwarders and other specialist organizations to help with them trading within the region under an FTA. So we see that Australian businesses really do partner and procure the services of customs brokers to do the documentation requirements on their behalf, or to advise them on rules of origin specific issues when they are exporting. But where we do find the biggest challenges, like everywhere else, it's really in the SME sector, and trying to support SMEs to understand FTAs, to understand how to export, and understand how to treat their product, particularly under RCEP. So that's where a lot of Australia's support goes, is into the SME community.
That sort of leads into the next question I wanted to ask. And I think this sort of comparative experience is important. We were talking earlier and wondering, you know, how to support Cambodian businesses understand the rules of origin. So how are Australian businesses helped to understand the rules of origin? You mentioned that brokers actually play a big role. So is it through brokers actually reaching out to the businesses, or what is the level of support from government? How do they explain and reach out to, especially the SMEs, to talk about the potentials and benefits?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I think there's two sort of streams of support. One is from the private sector, and the other is from the public sector through the government. The private sector, businesses do reach out to the chambers of commerce, to expert international export advisory organizations, customs brokers, to freight forwarders, or to their industry groups that represent their product. So I think within the private sector, there is already in Australia a lot of support for traders to tap into, and that's something I think that would be very beneficial, for Cambodian businesses to, if available, to tap into, the equivalent resources that they have here in Cambodia. In the public sector, the government does quite a lot of support, and His Excellency Sim Sok-heng did mention quite a bit of support that that Cambodia government and MOC provides to Cambodian businesses. The Australian government does something very similar as well. We provide an online portal called the Free Trade Agreements FTA portal, which is a one-stop shop for the public to enter a description of their good or the HS code of their good into the portal, and then they can compare which free trade agreement gives them the most benefit in terms of tariff preference when exporting to a particular market. It also provides information on all the rules of origin for every FTA that Australia has, based on each product that someone is interested in, as well as all the documentation requirements that are required to export your product. So this is a very valuable tool that we see a lot of Australian businesses tap into when they're looking at exporting overseas. Australia also produces a business guide, similar to what Cambodia does as well, a business guide for traders, which one is focused on the export side, and we have one that is focused on the import side into Australia, so very customs specific rules. And then we also have, in previous times before COVID, we had what we call a sort of FTA roadshow, where the government trade negotiators and experts would travel around the country to different cities and hold workshops with interested industry groups and traders to talk about the FTAs and how they can tap into those as well. So there are several areas that the Australian government provides support to traders, and we see that this is very something that, particularly for SMEs and the small medium enterprise sector, is something that's very valuable for them, because otherwise they would find it very difficult to understand export markets and understand how to actually comply with the rules of origin within an FTA.
Thank you. I think that's very interesting, hearing more about how this works in Australia and the outreach and the support available. I don't know if you'd be brave enough, but do you have any recommendations that you would like to give to Cambodian business?
I think it's sort of been mentioned previously, but I think for Cambodian business, if you want to understand RCEP, read the agreement. So chapter 3 is rules of origin in the RCEP agreement. Chapter 4 is the customs and trade facilitation chapter. They go hand in hand, and I think really the first step is reading the agreement, understanding what it means. It's quite complex, but it's very important to understand what are the rules and what benefits that they provide. I think secondly, tap into your business resources in the private sector. So, industry groups that might represent a particular Cambodian business sector, tap into those networks because those are very valuable with understanding what other people are doing, how they are attracting investment or exporting under RCEP or exporting into neighboring countries, and getting their experiences about how they are doing things. And then lastly, I think really tapping into the Cambodian government resources as best you can, working with Ministry of Commerce or the Ministry of Finance or the Agricultural Ministry to share, your challenges and to ask for support, because I think it was mentioned earlier, the need to have workshops that are run by government to help traders to better understand rules of origin or better understand how they can the documentation requirements under the agreement. So these are all, I think, very valuable tools that Cambodian businesses can tap into. And lastly, I think just to finish this off, the benefits of RCEP won't happen immediately for Cambodian businesses. It's not just because people aren't trading under RCEP right now isn't a bad thing. It takes time to understand the FTA, and really over the next year, particularly with post-COVID economic recovery and businesses starting to look more and more to the region to export their products, I think over the next 2 years or so, it will be very important for Cambodian businesses to really look into RCEP to see how that can support them and support the nation to grow economically post-COVID.
Thank you for that very good advice. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. I think they're really more, they could be directed towards any of the panelists. I'm sure you'd all have opinions about them. The first one is, what are some of the key long-term implications of RCEP and rules of origin? Do you expect there to be less reliance on exporters outside of RCEP in the future? Because ideally a sustainable supply chain would be built here. So that's one question I've received. I don't know if Clint or Robin, if you have any thoughts about that you'd like to offer.
Yeah, sure, Jeremy. I think, of course, there is a compelling case with RCEP, and I think as Robin touched on with respect to from a Cambodian context, the ability to tap into global supply chains, and with respect in particular to agriculture, which is industries which are being promoted under the law of investment. The idea of having your supply chain self-contained in RCEP is indeed a compelling proposition. But I think we still need to be mindful that there are significant markets currently that Cambodia export to, of which those countries do not belong to RCEP. The States in particular is a major export market for Cambodia. So I think whilst there is a compelling argument, we should learn the lessons from the ABA with respect to Europe, and try not to put all our eggs in one basket, and to diversify our export markets as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Clint. Did you want to add anything to that, Robin?
I think that's a good question. I think just like Clint said, diversification of market access is very important, and managing risk in the business environment. So really, a reliance wholly on RCEP is probably not the greatest business model for long-term longevity within a global supply chain. So being able to import goods from outside of RCEP and incorporate that into the RCEP regional supply chain is something that I think will continue to be very valuable. So even though that RCEP might encourage a RCEP only sort of supply and production chain, we have to remember that RCEP has very liberal rules of origin that allow input materials from outside of RCEP, from the US, from Europe, from Central and South America, for example, to come in and still be eligible for when produced within the RCEP region into other goods, still be eligible potentially under the RCEP banner. So I think it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 to 10 years as more of the regulatory arrangements come into place for RCEP over time, how this RCEP regional supply chain actually looks, and how countries like Cambodia actually start to play in that field.
Thank you. And I see actually Deborah has responded to that question as well in the questions and answer box, which I'm sure you can all access, but let me just read her response. If I had an option to use an RCEP qualified firm or any non-RCEP firm to do trade in Asia, I would likely pick RCEP firms. The benefit accelerates over time, so getting firms in will continue to win out over firms that are not part of RCEP. So thank you, Deborah, for your response there. Another question I'm going to ask, we are actually in time deficit, so we may have to make this the last question, but we have a question on any view on the cost of compliance to meet rules of origin versus tariff reduction benefits under RCEP. Clint, do you have any response to this question?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's pretty well documented that the certificate of origin fees in Cambodia are probably a bit higher than in other jurisdictions. But when you're comparing, say, I think the fees range from USD $18 to $54 to obtain a certificate of origin. When you compare those costs with the ability to utilize a tariff reduction or tariff elimination, I would suggest that the benefits of utilizing or tapping into RCEP would, in most cases, greatly outweigh the costs involved to be compliant.
Thank you. Robin?
Thanks, Jeremy. I think when it comes to compliance costs, there's also the cost of time as well, which businesses sort of factor into whether applying for a tariff preference under an FTA is really worth it. And under RCEP, there are requirements to keep records, to understand how your product is made, understand the costs of everything, so that when it comes time to export your goods and the importer is making a tariff claim, that they have all the necessary documentation, not just the certificate of origin, but also other evidence that can help them apply for that tariff. So there are other sort of resource constraints on businesses to comply with an FTA rule of origin. But like Clint said, these do not outweigh the benefits that a tariff preference can have, particularly for high value goods and consignments, which in a lot of cases, save, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in trade, per consignment or per year. So the benefit definitely outweighs any challenges that businesses might have with complying with ROO.
Thank you. We do actually have more questions and also responses in the chat box. Unfortunately, we really are out of time. But let's see if we can actually compile the questions and responses, and then we can send the responses out when we send you the link to the recording of today's event. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring this session to a close, but special thanks to Clint and Robin for joining us, and also to the audience for your questions. Thank you very much, and I will hand back to Sven for the third session, to introduce the third session.